27F, am in the middle of a fight with my soon-to-be ex-husband Jeff, who had an extramarital affair a couple of months ago. Jeff and I had been married for 2 years and we'd been together for almost 3 years before that. He and I had planned on beginning to try for a baby just 8 months into our marriage because we'd already been living together for 4 years at that point and we really wanted to start a family together, so it just felt right. Unfortunately, even after months and months of trying, I was still struggling with conceiving, so we had to get tested. Turns out that both my husband and I have fertility issues, so we had to give up on the idea for the time being. It hit me hard when the test results came back and I kind of shut down emotionally because I'd really wanted a baby of my own. Jeff, instead of being supportive during that time, distanced himself from me and we barely even spoke for a couple of months. I was already at my lowest by then and Jeff going further away from me just made it worse, so I thought about reaching out to him and making our marriage work. But before I could do that, he confessed to me that he'd been having an affair with an old friend and it had been going on for weeks. He'd sought out her help a couple of days after we got back the test results since he used to be good friends back in high school and she was in town for a conference. They had lunch together and then that turned into an opportunity for him to cheat on me with her. He told me that he'd wanted to tell me the truth, but I just seemed so distant and sad that he was afraid of how I'd react, so he just didn't say anything, which was a pretty ridiculous reason. I remember wanting to say a lot of things after he told me, mostly wanting to scream at him, but I couldn't bring myself to do any of it, so I just broke down on the couch and began to sob like a baby. He didn't even console me or anything, not even a pat on my arm to tell me it's gonna be alright. He just sat there like a damn statue and said nothing while I cried for almost an hour. After I finally eased up a little, he told me that he was going to spend the night at his parents' place because he needed a break from everything that was going on. I begged him to stay in spite of what he'd done, but he didn't wait around. He'd already had his bags packed before discussing this with me and then he just left. As soon as he left, I started crying again and remained in the same spot until midnight. It was pretty much the worst day of my life so far. I was so depressed that I wasn't responding to any calls or texts from anyone, not work, and not even people I knew personally. So a couple of friends and relatives had come to check up on me, but they'd leave when they realized that I wasn't going to open the door for them and let them in. I'd let them know I was still there by yelling out that they needed to leave and that I wasn't going to open the door. So they'd know I was okay and then leave. I'm grateful for the people who checked up on me, honestly, because I don't think I'd be here right now if it wasn't for them. All I did was have the minimum amount of food needed to keep going, watch TV, and then sleep. I was basically a zombie for almost 2 weeks. Then one day, one of my cousins came by and I told him to leave my living room, but he didn't go. Instead, he told me that he had important news to share and he needed to do it in person. I didn't take it seriously and argued with him, so he finally snapped and told me that he was here to inform me that my father had passed away that morning from a heart attack, and since I never checked my phone, people didn't have any way of letting me know about it. I was already pretty heartbroken from whatever had happened with Jeff, and then the news of my dad's demise just broke me even more. After my cousin who visited me to tell me the news left, I think I started crying so loudly that the neighbors had to come to my door to make sure I was okay. That evening I booked myself a flight back home for the funeral, and it was really difficult because I barely knew what I was doing all throughout. I had to be helped by people I barely even knew because I was so lost, but somehow I got back home safely and made it through the funeral. I was blank and didn't cry at the funeral much, but I'd planned on staying for 2 weeks at home with my mother so she'd have someone to count on. She was devastated at the funeral and didn't leave my side even for a second, but we barely got to speak because of the sheer number of guests and relatives showing up. My dad was a well-known man. He was an attorney and was one of the best in his town. He was also a really good man and people loved him. Some people had even traveled overseas to pay their last respects, so you guys can imagine what sort of love and respect people had for him. My mother and I were overwhelmed, and for the 2 days after the funeral, we just made small talk, and I'm grateful for even that much because just 3 days after the funeral, I lost my mother as well. The medical report said that my mother had passed away due to natural causes, and since she'd passed in her sleep, it had been peaceful for her, but I knew that she'd passed away from a broken heart. Call me crazy, but that's what I really believed. Within days of my father's funeral, we had to organize another funeral for my mother, and this was smaller, but it hit me even harder than my dad's death because this had happened while I was fast asleep in the next room. I think I pretty much shut my brain off after my mom's passing and was a robot. I flew back home after the funeral and finished off some legal paperwork with the executor of their will, my dad's secretary. There was nothing for me to stay back anymore, so I came back to my own home and resumed my old routine of eating, watching television, and then going to sleep. My life spiraled out of control after that day because I was so depressed that I could barely bring myself to eat or sleep. I lost my job after 1 week because I hadn't shown up at work for a while, and neither had I told anyone anything about my absence, so they had reason to fire me without notice. Besides, it's been ages since I responded to anyone from work, so I should have seen it coming, but it was still a huge blow. This time hardly anyone came by to check on me because everyone thought that I was staying back at my childhood home, and it was a relief because I didn't want to see anyone and vice versa. So that was the last 4 months of my life after my parents' passing. I haven't had a job for almost 5 or 6 months and haven't done anything outside of the house for just as long, if not longer. I don't talk to anyone, and it was only recently that I realized that I've been a total mess. I've neglected everything apart from paying the rent and bills on time and doing the absolute bare minimum. I was in this state for almost 1.5 months until one day, I decided that I wanted to comb my hair because my head was really heavy and I wanted to do something about it because it was uncomfortable. I finally looked at myself in the mirror that day and realized that my hair was a rat's nest, my clothes were grimy and dirty, and my face was all sunken and hollow like I was straight out of some horror movie. I was disgusted by my appearance, but I still tried to brush my hair and the plastic hairbrush snapped into two because of how tangled my hair had become. It was a small, insignificant thing, but that was a wake-up call for me. I didn't know how that happened, but something just switched in me and I ended up falling to pieces in front of the mirror once more that day. This time, I was not crying just for the sake of it, but I just wanted to get it all out of my system before I went out to get my life back on track. That day, I got my hair done in a full-body spa and massage from one of the best salons I could find near me. I still had a ton of money that I'd set aside because I'd been saving when I'd been trying to get pregnant with Jeff. I had a well-paying job in the past, so money had never been an issue for me, and I hardly had any massive bills anymore since Jeff left and it was just me. I barely ate or did anything. I went out on a shopping spree, bought myself a couple of new dresses, and came back home. I realized the state of my home because I hadn't cleaned in ages, so I had to hire a cleaning service to do the job as well. I wasn't embarrassed of it in the slightest since I knew what I'd been through, and I think anyone who'd found out that they were basically infertile, had their husband cheat on them, lost both their parents and also their job in the span of just a couple of weeks, then they probably would have been gone by now. Once my house was clean and I was finally looking like a human being again, I started looking for therapists who could help me because I'd realized that I was probably clinically depressed and the shopping spree and stuff had helped a little, but it was just temporary. If I wanted to get out of this mess, then I'd need professional help, and I wasn't ready to go back to the condition I was in for so long. Along with therapists, I also started looking for jobs and made sure that I explained my circumstances to my ex-employers as well in case I needed recommendation letters or stuff. To my surprise, my ex-boss ended up inviting me back to work if I was up for it because she said that her son was an advocate for mental health awareness and he'd be disappointed if she didn't at least give me an opportunity to get my life back on track. She also offered to put me in touch with her son, who worked with a lot of great mental health professionals who could help me out and make my search for a good therapist easier. I agreed to all of it, and I'm truly and sincerely thankful that she turned out to be such a wonderful woman because I got my job back and also started seeing a therapist as soon as I settled on one. I've been attending therapy sessions every week for almost a month now, and I feel like I'm finally getting better. The only thing I hadn't done so far was that I hadn't filed for divorce from Jeff because I didn't think I wanted to leave this marriage just yet, and I really had faith that he'd come back. Also, I'd forgotten that I had to do that because I was depressed about my life. So I didn't think about divorce and just waited around like an idiot. Then finally, about 4 days back, I received a call from him. Usually, I don't answer calls from anyone, but since it was Jeff, I got really excited and answered the call. I'd barely spoken to anyone or even heard my voice, but I was happy to hear from him because I was delusional enough to believe that he was calling me to get back together. It had been almost 4 months since he left the house and we last spoke, and in the meantime, a lot had happened. I was finally doing better now, so I hoped that his coming back to me would be the beginning of a fresh start for the both of us. He even hinted at it by inviting me for dinner at a restaurant we loved going to when we were together, and I agreed to see him there. I got all dressed up and went out to see him that evening and even hugged him and stuff when I saw him. He looked happy to see me too, but he didn't ask me any questions and jumped straight to his own life and how fabulous it had been for the last couple of months. He told me that he'd been traveling ever since he left me and that he'd seen a number of places so far, all beautiful, and had also met numerous people. He mentioned that his old friend, who he'd had the affair with, had convinced him to go away for some soul searching, and he brought it up really casually as well, but he was speaking about it in the past tense, so I thought that maybe that was done with. I even asked him if they were together and he laughed and said no because apparently she was too busy to commit to a relationship and he didn't want one just yet. I was relieved, but like an idiot, I didn't even bother to think that just because they weren't together, it didn't mean that they didn't still have a thing together, because the reasons he'd given me were that they were too busy and non-committal to be together, not that they didn't like each other. I was so happy to see him that I missed a lot of the things he was saying and convinced myself that he was back for me and we'd live happily ever after now. I was shocked by the end of the evening when he didn't ask anything about me, and neither did he apologize for anything, but I still stayed, hoping that something would happen. We made a lot of small talk, and after we'd ordered dessert, I finally decided to steer the conversation towards our relationship myself and ask him how he dealt with our separation. He told me that it had probably been easier for him than it had been for me, and then touched my hand and told me that he knew I'd lost both parents within days of each other since a couple of my friends had come to know about it from my mother's Facebook feed and then told him about it. I was shocked because I thought he hadn't known, and that's why he hadn't brought it up so far. That's why he hadn't bothered to call me or even visit me, but when I realized that he'd known all along, all the warning bells started going off in my head at full volume because he'd known and he still hadn't cared enough to come see me and make sure I was okay. Forget about visiting me, he hadn't even tried to contact me to make sure I was fine. So that was the first shock for me, and then he went on talking and told me that he was really sad to learn about the demise of my parents because he really liked them, but he was too busy traveling to contact me and figured that he'd do it once he was back. I smiled and said nothing because I was trying to process it in my head. And then he told me that he'd also wanted to talk to me about something that he'd been thinking about for a long time now, which was also the reason he'd asked me out on dinner that day. I thought that this was finally where he would ask me to get back together, but instead, he asked me if I'd given any thought to what I'd want to keep during the divorce. When I looked confused and asked him what the hell he was talking about, he explained that since it had been a long time since we'd broken up, he thought that it was finally time to file for divorce officially so we could move on with our lives. That's when I finally realized that this wasn't a dinner date where we would end up getting back together, but one where we would officially end our marriage. It was more of a goodbye dinner than anything else, and I, like an absolute idiot, had completely misread the situation. I was already embarrassed, but I was also pretty pissed off because he'd been a total jerk to me and hadn't even bothered to check on me, whether I was even alive or not, for almost 4 months. But now he had the audacity to invite me for dinner like we were buddies and then go on and on about how brilliantly life had treated him in these past couple of months. And then he asked me that after he'd heard about my parents passing, He'd been intending to ask me about the inheritance that I'd be left with. He said he wanted to wait a respectable period of time before asking me how much we were going to inherit from my parents. At that point, I was so incredibly to inherit anything. But I was going to inherit close to $7 million and all he was going to get was a divorce. I'd already been in talks with my parents' attorney and I told him to sell all the property that had been left to me because I had no intention of moving back home. The estimated amount of everything that would be sold plus the amount that my parents had left me came up to almost $7 million. My dad was rich and my mother never worked, but she had a huge inheritance from her parents, so that's not a surprise, but the probate process had to be completed before I got any of it. They'd already left me close to $2 million that I'd get as soon as the probate process was done, and then I'd have to wait for a couple of weeks before their assets were sold off. They already had a bunch of buyers, so I wouldn't have to wait for long. And since Jeff had been going on and on about how fabulous his life had been ever since he'd left me, I thought that I'd give him a taste of his own medicine and tell him about how wonderful my life was going to be now that I was done with him. We live in a state where inheritance is not considered a joint asset, and so, he cannot claim it, and since he'd already admitted to infidelity, he couldn't claim alimony either. I rubbed all of this in his face and told him about how his leaving me was probably the best thing that had ever happened to me, since I would hate to have to stay with him even after my life was finally coming back on track. I told him that he deserved every single bit of misery that he was feeling because now I was rich and he wasn't, and it showed on his face. Then, I stormed out of the restaurant and drove back home. He hasn't tried to contact me, but my in-laws have, and they told me that what I did was disgusting because first, I wasn't able to give him a child, which drove him to cheat on me, and now, I'm not even willing to do the bare minimum and share some of my wealth with the man who had supported me all along. I hung up on them without any argument because I didn't think I needed to dignify any of it, but his friends and family have been hounding me ever since our dinner date about what I did, and I'm seriously beginning to question if it was the right move to rub it in his face. Maybe I should have just left without bragging about it. Ida for bragging about my inheritance after my husband cheated on me and left me at my lowest point? Update 1. Hey, I filed for divorce from my husband. It's been 3 weeks since the incident, and his family and friends have taken the harassment to a crazy level. They're literally going off on me on social media and have practically started a hate campaign against me for putting Jeff through mental distress on purpose just so I could get revenge on him because he had cheated on me. And then blamed me for his cheating as well by saying that I'd withdrawn from him emotionally, so he had no option but to seek affection somewhere else, and it just so happened that a friend of his happened to be back in town. So he's absolved of all the blame and I'm the villain here, even though he was also facing fertility issues, but I never went out of my way to find someone else and talk to them out of desperation. But whatever, I've filed for divorce and I'm going to make sure that I don't let him off the hook easily. I'll also sue his parents and friends after warning them that they need to stop, because word of this has reached a couple of my coworkers too, and I can't compromise my reputation over this bullcrap. Update 2. Jeff's actually contesting the divorce. Why? Because he's suddenly had a change of heart and now he thinks we're meant to be together. I'm sure this has nothing to do with the inheritance, and he's doing this all purely out of his own love and affection for me. That's probably also why he made his folks stop harassing me online, so he could get back with me since he loved me and not because I threatened to sue them all for defaming me. I'm being sarcastic, obviously. I talked to him a couple of hours ago on the phone when I found out that he was contesting the divorce, and he told me that he changed his mind and that he wanted to make our marriage work. I got into a very nasty fight with him because I was just feeling so frustrated and hateful, and all he said to me was he knew I was mad because I still loved him, and if I didn't still love him, then I probably wouldn't even have called him. He reassured me that this was just a stupid game that I was playing to get back at him for the cheating and that we'd be just fine, and then disconnected the call. I'm in disbelief right now, and I cannot believe this is happening to me. I've never, ever felt such a strong urge to slap someone senseless, but I guess there's a first time for everything. He just is a huge jerk, and I can't believe I even considered getting back together with him. Freaking gold digger. Ugh, I could just scream right now, but that wouldn't help. Please, if someone has any advice on a way to mess him up but legally, do go ahead and let me know, because I have nothing to lose at this point. Update 3. Hello, folks. It's been a while, but we're in the middle of the mediation process now. If this doesn't work out to bring him and me on the same page, then we might have to go to court, but I have a feeling that's going to happen, and it'll be better for us since I can't see us coming to an agreement about any of this. He feels that we should stick together, and I don't. I don't even understand what the point of having a negotiation meeting is when this is pretty much non-negotiable for me. I do not want to be with him. It's as simple as that. I'm entertaining it because he wants to give it a try, even though it's exhausting, but then I know this will go to court, and I'm hoping that'll make everything better, for me at least. I don't know about him, and neither do I care, very honestly. Update 4. Hey, guys. Almost 2 months since the last update, and well, the case ended up going to court just as I predicted, and I'm going to get a divorce alright. It doesn't matter what he wants anymore, and boy, was he upset about it. The probate is done too, and I'll recover all the money I spent on my lawyer and even more soon enough. Life's good, so I don't think I'll be coming back here anytime soon. It's been a good ride, but I'm fine now. Thank you for all the love and support. I couldn't have done it without you guys, and I mean it.